Oh, hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Well, as Christine Lagarde might call it, funny money. Let's get into it. Stacy.
Right. Where's my money? Because more money is being handed out. And in the second half, we talk to Dominic Frisby about his new edition of the American version of Daylight Robbery, about the history of taxation. It's very fascinating, but it's relevant to today. Because as we see the money printer go brrr, it's the same story that's been going on since ancient Mesopotamia of men with guns, as Paul Krugman calls them, like to come around and collect some of your money or try to redistribute it around as favors to some groups of people over other groups of people. Well, Biden should send every American as much money as Jeff Bezos has. We should demand it. Where's my money, Joe? That's what I had tweeted because, you know, they're getting ready for another $1.9 trillion to send out, and they're trying to allocate who gets it this time. And of course, the last go around, we saw basically the oligarchs plunder most of it. Ordinary people did receive quite a bit, but now they're handing out some more money.
You know, the problem is the money itself. That's the problem. So, therefore, the solution to any of the perceived problems can never be to hand out more of the foundational problem, and that is the money itself. This fiat money. Since 1971, no fiat money in the world has ever been really now connected to anything that you would equate with a store of value. It's just basically an accounting fraud, essentially. In the United States, they print trillions and trillions of dollars. They claw back some of that in taxes, which is completely unnecessary. They drop it by the trillions on the pallet load full in places like Iraq without any accountability whatsoever. And then there's always this question like, why is everything so messed up? Why is the country falling apart? Why is there social unrest? Without understanding, and Paul Krugman is got to be the most blind to this of anyone in the United States. It's the money.
What's that saying? Something along the lines of like, if you show me who pays them, then I'll show you the incentive structure. Charlie Munger. So, you know, you tune into the cable news, you tune into any political debate, and what you see is the fact that, as Dominic Frisby points out in the interview that you're about to see, is all of these measures going back to ancient Mesopotamia start as a temporary thing. Always, the population only allows it if there's a war or a crisis. So thus, it becomes, especially in a fiat age, a permanent crisis. We have permanent financial collapse. We have permanent wars. I don't know how many my taxes right now go to support around the world, but there are plenty of them right now happening. So you have permanent, bad times, permanent pessimism. That's why in Bitcoin, what we call it, and that was the title of our New Year's Eve show, is relentless optimism, because all the incentives are not to have war, not to waste it on killing people around the world that you don't even know for no reason at all. So I think we could change that.
It's funny because back in the medieval times, the problem were despots and kings, and they had the authority to just take not money, but pay in kind, as it was called. We take part of your crop. We take your part of your family. We'll take your daughter. You know, we'll take whatever we want to take. And then there was this whole process starting with Magna Carta, leading to the Enlightenment, leading to the rights of man, leading to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, where there was power was supposed to be balanced in the social contract, as John Locke called it. But what we've got now in the United States and around the world is a return to despotism. The taxation based on the spurious. It's just spurious taxation without any accountability. That's we're back to the Middle Ages.
Bitcoin is holding it accountable, and that's what you see on CNBC. Actually, there are literally presenters going on there and pleading with the U.S. government to do something to stop it, because the U.S. dollar will die, they're saying, if this continues. So remember, last year in, what was it, April or May, when we handed out $1,200 to everybody under a certain income, well, that $1,200 stimulus is now worth $7,809. That's up 551% since then. Of course, I mean, a lot of stuff is up a lot, right? That's the taxation without legislation, as Dominic Frisby calls it. That's the inflation that is happening. Inflation is taxation.
Well, this is the ultimate win-win-win for people who have a ability to see clearly. The problem, the reason why Bitcoin is skyrocketing is because there's hyperinflation in America. And the US dollar is in a hyperinflationary collapse against Bitcoin. And the solution, as we've been describing by these policymakers, will always be to print more money. So that means that Bitcoin is on a one-way trip higher because they have no other policy solution than to print money. So therefore, that stimulus money is up 500 or 600%. It's going to be up 6,000%. And it's going to and continue to go higher because the policymakers are this arbitrary despotism we see in Washington and other power centers around the world is fueled by hubris and rank imbecility. And they're just going to keep printing. And, well, you know, my Bitcoin's up 9 million% since I first bought it. And it's probably going to go up another 40x.
Well, the hyperinflation, of course, is it's a political event. It's when people lose faith in the institutions that are governing the currency, governing the money. And we certainly see that. We've seen that with the disintegration, in riots across the world, but also in America, because back in 2008, they weren't, we had Occupy Wall Street that happened and that was quickly dispersed. But it does seem like there's like breakaway sort of groups starting to be dissatisfied. And I think that could be a sign of that. And Bitcoin, that Bitcoin price is showing you $7,809 for that 1,200 stimulus check. It's up 551% since it was first issued. That's like how the wealthy get to live, right? They front run everybody. These more checks are coming. Biden's meeting with Jamie Dimon and all these bankers to decide, how much he's telling them what he's going to give you so that Jamie Dimon can make sure he stays a billionaire, right? And that you get, the ordinary chump getting some money that doesn't inflate away. Because he doesn't want to pay taxes, right? Because remember, Dominic Frisby says inflation is a tax. So he doesn't want to pay those taxes. He's not going to pay them. So what's he going to do? He's going to buy Bitcoin. He's going to buy assets. He's going to buy commodities like Stan Druckenmiller. He's going to go very, very short the dollar like Stan Druckenmiller. He's going to, buy Modigliani's, as Max always says, or Picasso's.
Yeah, Jamie Dimon is the Dr. Kevorkian of economics. If he shows up in your office, you've got trouble, big trouble. And there's the administration talking to this euthanasia doctor named Jamie Dimon about how best to euthanize America. And Jamie says the best way to euthanize America is to print money.
Well, certainly the U.S. dollar, euthanize the U.S. dollar, and it could be better for everybody after it's gone. So hopefully, for the majority of people, and I don't think it's going to be so good for the Jamie Dimons of the world, but for the bottom 99%, I think it's going to be better if it's not the reserve currency, because remember, you have to run a massive trade deficit to have the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. Sure, they get to, be men with guns and thuggery and, beat people up that they don't like in Iran or Venezuela or whatever, and they get to shut them off from the grid, but at a huge cost to your own domestic population. Now we look at another Bitcoin story, and of course, this is kind of funny because everybody hates Elon Musk, of course, on Wall Street. Everybody hates him in the mainstream media, that he keeps succeeding. He keeps delivering results for his shareholders, whether it's in Tesla or SpaceX. He keeps like everybody, kind of in the mainstream media, the orthodoxy, they wanted his SpaceX to fail, but it was brilliant. It went to the space station. It delivered all that stuff. Well, as we covered, he bought $1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin for Tesla. Tesla are already up over $500 million on their Bitcoin investment, nearly outperforming their entire 2020 earnings of $721 million.
They've made more on their Tesla investment in less than 6 months than they've ever made in the entirety on their business of selling cars.
Yes, on their Bitcoin rather than their Tesla.
On their Bitcoin.
And that actually brings up, they could have bought instead more their own shares. That's the standard thing to do. But Michael Saylor of MicroStrategy blew that operation out of the water.
Well, because as I've explained, this is based on the 1993 Soros attack on the Bank of England, which was a speculative attack. He could borrow money cheaply from these banks and attack a big bank like the Bank of England, and force them out of the European exchange rate mechanism, and made a quick $1 billion. And Stan Druckenmiller orchestrated that speculative attack. This is a speculative attack that Elon Musk is making on the Fed, right? So he's already gone to war with the SEC, the SEC. He's already gone to war with the SEC, and he's shown them to be venal and captured. Now he's gone to war with the Fed and say, I'm not going to buy back my own stock. I'm going to take your cheap money. I'm going to buy Bitcoin like Michael Saylor's doing. And now, 500 other CEOs in the S&P 500 are like, you know what? That's a darn good idea.
The SEC? Is that what you call it?
The SEC.
Is that the word you use on Wall Street?
The SEC. Yeah, it's like an abbreviation, the SEC. Yeah, the SEC.
I've never heard that. All right. Well, there are all these emergencies, financial crashes caused by all the fraud on Wall Street and all this chaos that ensues. And everybody, I remember back in 2008, the people called their congressman to pass that TARP because their stock prices went down, the stock portfolios went down. So, of course, it's permanent since then, right? There's permanent QE since 2008. So, these nonstop crises cause all this inflation and this nonstop taxation and the hamster wheel of ever having to create ever more to be stolen ever more. So I want to look at this quick headline here. This is just a reflection of the absurdity of the society and culture and economy around us. In 2040, we will collectively decide to flood the atmosphere with aerosols. And that's because of all the CO2 in the atmosphere. Again, because we have fiat money and we have this never-ending need to keep on printing more in order to tax more through inflation in order to continue our wars against the economy, essentially. This is the way we operate.
All right. Well, Mike Judge made a great movie called Idiocracy.
Yeah.
And they were watering their front lawn with a sports drink and wondering why the grass died. And then somebody who was reanimated from the past was brought back to life, who had some brain cells left from the past, and he became president overnight because he knew that you shouldn't water the grass with Gatorade. So this is literally going into idiocracy land now.
Yeah.
The institutional level is so broken down and imbecilic that they can't walk and chew gum at the same time, much less run an economy.
I would say that's also a good analogy for all the money printing. This is exactly as insane as what the central banks are doing.
Up. Insanity is trading up in America and around the world. When we come back, we're going to be talking to Dominic Frisby about his book, Daylight Robbery. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Dominic Frisby. He's the author of Daylight Robbery, which will soon be available all over the United States of America. Dominic, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks very much, Max. Yep, Daylight Robbery. It comes out in the US this week. I'm delighted.
Now, remind the audience of how daylight robbery is a term coined off of UK taxes, and what are the most unique traits of US taxes. I mean, it really is a fascinating story. Dominic, tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, the expression daylight robbery, its thought dates back to the window tax, which we had in the UK, and it was introduced in 1694, I think, shortly after the Glorious Revolution, in order to pay for lots of wars abroad. All taxes are always introduced to pay for wars. And it like a lot of taxes, it just stayed for much longer than it should. And people started building houses with fewer and fewer windows in order to avoid paying the tax. People blocked up their windows altogether, and entire tenement blocks were built with no windows at all. And in those days, there was no electric light, there was no gas lights, there were no oil lamps. We lit with candles and rush lights. So to lose your daylight was no small sacrifice. And it had the consequence of making the unintended consequence of making people far more ill than they need have been during the Industrial Revolution. The damped, cramped, windowless dwellings contributed to the outbreaks of cholera and typhus and all the rest of it. And for years, there were campaigns, songs were sung, pamphlets were handed out, scientific studies were shown to prove that the tax made people ill, but people still continued with it. And when the matter was eventually debated in Parliament, it said that MPs cried out daylight robbery, and that's where the expression comes from. The other expression we get from taxation is nosy Parker. Mr. Parker was the tax collector, apparently. There's all sorts of weird things in our lives that date back to some kind of historical tax story that we didn't previously, that maybe people don't realize.
Right. The Beatles, didn't they do a song about the tax man? It's so much part of popular culture. And of course, America decided they had enough of your taxes, and we staged the Revolutionary War to get rid of those taxes. But now we're out taxing and almost out taxing you guys, let me ask you this question, Dominic Frisby. After trillions of dollars were printed and sent to individuals and companies across America last year, many are now thinking, why do we need taxes in an all-fiat world when all this money is printed? I mean, this is a question that comes up now. The government printed in 1 week as money that equaled all of last year's tax take. So why even bother why bother if you can just print the money, Dominic?
I don't know. This is the argument that gets used. Why do you need taxation if you have a magic money tree? And the answer that's given is that you need tax in order to stop inflation. Never mind that they're inflating by printing money. The statistic that I read is that 25% of US dollars in existence were printed last year. And of course, inflation is just taxation by another means. It's another way of extracting wealth. Milton Friedman called it taxation without legislation. Now, it's great that you mention the American Revolution and how America was built on low taxes, but this is the sort of cycle that empires and nations and governments go through. Their heyday is when taxes are very low, 10, 15, 20% of GDP, but gradually it creeps up over time. And as it does, the state grows, corruption grows, innovation shrinks, inventiveness shrinks, and it just is this sort of steady creep. But you do need some kind of war in order to introduce, or a crisis to introduce. There's this long relationship between tax and war. Tax makes war possible. Tax is how you pay for war. You tax and then you plunder and then you tax afterwards. But also, war makes tax possible. History is littered with examples of leaders trying to introduce new taxes during peacetime, and it's never works. It often results in their being overthrown. But with a war, you get the opportunity to impose the new tax, and then after the crisis has passed, taxation never goes back to the level at which it was before the crisis started. And you even see that if quantitative easing is a tax, and I think it is, that would never have been passed were it not for 2008 and the banking crisis. But now it's normal. And this new one, COVID, all sorts of money printing has gone on there. And the magic money tree has been normalized, Matt.
Right. Now, Nobel economist Paul Krugman said that the U.S. dollar is better than Bitcoin because the U.S. dollar is, quote, backed by men with guns, i.e. the tax collector, the armed tax collector. Now, the earliest human writings are tax records from Mesopotamia, which sound remarkably like a Krugman New York Times piece. Tell us about what you see in Mesopotamia.
We talk about taxation, and I'm sort of have a lot of sympathy to the anarcho-capitalist mindset as a Bitcoiner. But in reality, there has never been a civilization without taxation of some kind. And even in ancient Mesopotamia, even in the hunter-gatherer societies that predated ancient Mesopotamia, there still existed this sort of sense of duty to the greater collective. And it's interesting, that word duty. Often taxes, the words we use for taxes, have this sort of moral undercurrent to them. And in ancient Mesopotamia, the very first written records we have were tax records. And the very first money we used, apart from gold and silver, were little bits of mud molded into shapes. A cone representing a sheep, a disc representing some barley, and they were baked inside clay balls. And then when the debt was settled, the clay ball was smashed open. But then people found that it was actually quicker just to inscribe the clay with pictures instead. And thus did the very first system of hieroglyphs and writing emerge. But it was a bit like an early blockchain in a way, these records of transactions, of debts owed. But the most common debt owed was, of course, taxation, what you owed to your leader. Tax wasn't always paid in money, of course, because money wasn't widespread in those days. It was paid in kind, a share of your produce or a share of your labor.
And that word duty, of course, is used in duty-free shops at the airport, meaning tax-free shops. Again, a use of that word. Now, you make the connection there. You talk about money itself. And one of the problems is that, it's remarkable that the excuse made for collecting tax is that it needs to stop inflation or control inflation, when, as you point out, it's the very mechanism that is really in the money printing is creating the inflation. And this idea that somebody in the center of government can figure out and calculate, well, if we lend out a certain amount of money through money printing and then we claw it back through taxes, and the result is going to end up being some kind of GDP growth. It's like a push me, pull you bicycle, isn't it? It's like the Dr. Dolittle with his two-headed dromedary. They're going in two opposite directions. It makes no fundamental sense, Dominic.
Well, not to me. I mean, I'm a great believer in letting, you know, the aggregation of a million individual decisions results in a better outcome than one guy and one bureaucrat somewhere, you know, setting the law and setting the rates and telling everyone else what to do. And, you know, this kind of meddling in the money system, people have done it through history, and it might not end badly immediately, but eventually it always ends badly. And, you know, Bitcoin is infinitely superior. The inflation rate of Bitcoin is transparent. It's set in code. It can't be meddled with. It's there for everybody to see. Everyone knows exactly how many Bitcoins are going to be printed. It's not vulnerable to the whims of some state actor. So for Paul Krugman to call it inferior to the US dollar, you know, he needs to go and have an argument with Elon Musk, I think.
They just don't have the same opinion about what money and what money is. And of course, now the book is called Daylight Robbery. So you've got a U.S. version coming out of this book. And it really is a fascinating history of money taxations and kind of a precursor to Bitcoin. In other words, Bitcoin solves a problem. The problem is fiat money and bureaucrats imposing taxes. So that's the problem Bitcoin solves. And it goes back many hundreds of years. And of course, I could have quoted Shakespeare, but I chose to quote something from Dr. Dolittle because I feel that was the height of literature achievement in your country's history, in my opinion. Now, there is a connection to violence, right? And right now we see a surfeit of violence, really social violence, so much so, Dominic. In America, they're going to be passing anti-terror laws against their own citizens. And that's a direct result of money printing and fiat money printing. And, you know,
everything that's wrong in the world, it comes back to fiat money. Not everything that's wrong in the world, but so many of the world's problems come back to this flawed money is the blood of an economy, and it's essential that blood is healthy, and fiat money is not healthy. It just enables people to do things that just shouldn't be, that shouldn't be done. And you know, every single, we come back to tax and money are inherently related. Anyone who's interested in Bitcoin will be interested in this story. Anyone who's interested in gold. The tax is how you design a society. Every war in history is made possible by some sort of tax, but also war makes tax possible. There's this relationship. And I talk a lot about history, tax throughout history, but I also talk about the future because you design a society the way you tax it, whether that society will be prosperous or poor, the people will be free or subordinated. It all comes back to the tax system. Tax is power. Whether it's government, king or emperor, whoever the leader is, if they lose their tax revenue, they lose their power. And, you know, if we want to design a better society, I think most of us do, the place to do it is the tax system. Tax is patient zero. If you get the tax right, everything else can follow. And by the way, I regard inflation, money printing, as a form of taxation without legislation.
Yeah, somebody would agree with that. And it just comes back with what do you consider to be money in this case? And in the U.S. forming documents, of course, they were talking about gold and silver as the only real money. They try to avoid fiat money. They hated the Bank of England. Ben Franklin said it was the chief cause for the revolution was to get away from the Bank of England. And 1694, that was just about the time the Bank of England was created, if I'm not mistaken. So central.
It was. Yeah. We used to have a thing called the half tax, which was a tax on every fireplace, every stove. And twice a year, tax collectors would come into your house and count the number of stoves you had. And it was a bit like the BBC license fee bloke. And this was considered a violation of the Englishman's privacy. And so when William of Orange became King of England, in order to ingratiate himself with the newly conquered people, he got rid of the tax. And then all of a sudden he found himself without any money and various wars abroad, which he needed to wage. And that's why he gave us firstly the Bank of England and then the window tax.
Yeah, fascinating the way these things echo through history. And our history, your history, is so much enmeshed over hundreds of years, and the tax man has played a vital role. And you know what?
I mean, it was the American Civil War that gave America income tax for the very first time was levied during the Civil War, then during World War One, and then 1942, the Revenue Act. That's what brought tax to every man in America. And it was also the Civil War that gave America the IRS. That was another one of Abraham Lincoln's great contributions.
Wow, Dominic, this is fascinating. I wish we had more time, but we got to say goodbye. Hopefully we can pick it up when you're more in the U.S. with your book, Daylight Robbery by Dominic Frisby. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Not at all, Max. Thanks for having me.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. Want to thank our guest, Dominic Frisby. Until next time, bye, y'all.